The woman at our front door was 41 years old, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who had prepared for this moment, and she had a lawyer standing one step behind her on the porch like punctuation at the end of a sentence. It was a Tuesday morning in March, 22 days after we had buried my father. My mother answered the door in her robe. She had not been sleeping well. Nobody had been sleeping well. The house on Mercer Street still had sympathy flowers on the kitchen counter and casserole dishes from the neighbors stacked by the sink, and my father's reading glasses were still on the side table by his chair because none of us had been able to move them. The woman said her name. She said she was sorry for our loss. She said it the way people say things when they have rehearsed the courtesy but not the feeling. Then she said, "My name is Diane Farrow. I was Dennis Calloway's wife, and I have a legal claim to this property." My mother looked at her for a long moment. Then my mother said, "I know who you are. Come in." And she stepped back from the door. I was standing in the hallway, 23 years old, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold, and I watched the woman who had been living 40 minutes away in a house my father paid for, raising 2 children whose names I would not learn until later, walk across my mother's threshold. And I watched my mother close the door behind her with the particular quiet of a woman who had known this moment was coming and had spent 6 months getting ready for it. Before I tell you what happened in that living room, I need to tell you who my father was, both of him. My father's name was Dennis Allen Calloway. He was 57 years old when he died, and he was, by every measure I had available to me for the first 22 years of my life, a good man. I want to sit with that for a moment, not to excuse what he did, not to soften it or give it a more palatable shape, but because the hardest part of what I am about to tell you is not the betrayal itself. It is the specific grief of discovering that the person who betrayed you was also, genuinely, the person you loved. That both things are true. That there is no version of this story where the man who made me laugh at breakfast every morning for 18 years is entirely fictional. He was not fictional. He was real. He was also a liar of extraordinary discipline, sustained over 19 years, and those 2 facts have to exist in the same sentence because that is where they actually live. Dennis Calloway grew up in a small city in Ohio. Middle child of 3, father was a machinist, mother taught elementary school. He was the first in his family to go to college, a state school, accounting, 4 years on partial scholarship and part-time work at a hardware store. He graduated in 1990 and took a job at a regional firm in Dayton, and 6 months into that job, he met my mother at a mutual friend's birthday party. My mother's name is Patricia. She was 24, working as a nurse, and she tells the story of meeting my father with the particular fondness of someone who has told it many times and still believes the beginning of it. He was terrible at dancing, she says, just spectacularly bad. But he didn't know it and he kept going. There's something very attractive about a man who is bad at something and doesn't care. They married in 1993. I was born in 1995. My brother Marcus was born in 1998. We lived in the house on Mercer Street, which my parents bought in 1994, a 4-bedroom colonial with a front porch and a maple tree in the yard, and a kitchen that my mother renovated herself one summer with YouTube tutorials, and a determination that impressed even the contractor she eventually hired for the parts she couldn't do alone. That house was my mother's. Not legally, at first, both names on the deed, the way married couples do. But in every way that matters, in every layer of labor and love and 20 years of Saturday morning effort, that house was hers. My father commuted 40 minutes each way to his accounting firm, where he had made partner in 2003. He was home by 6:30 most evenings. He coached my brother Marcus's soccer team for 3 seasons. He built a tree house in the backyard when I was 9 that we used until I was 16 and Marcus was 13, and we both outgrew it, but nobody took it down because my mother said it was part of the yard now. He was present. That is what I keep coming back to. He was genuinely, consistently present. Which means that the other life, the one 40 minutes away in Harwick, was happening in the gaps I never thought to look at. The Tuesday night accounting dinners, the quarterly client retreats, the golf Saturdays with colleagues I'd never met, the occasional overnight when a client situation required it. He was an accountant. His schedule had legitimate reasons for irregularity. He had constructed, I later understood, a professional life with exactly the right amount of flexible geography to sustain a second one. His name in Harwick was also Dennis. He didn't change that. Maybe he couldn't keep track of two names. Maybe after a certain number of years, the fiction had its own momentum and changing the name would have required explaining why. What he changed was the last name. In Harwick, he was Dennis Farrow. He had taken Diane's name, which was unusual enough that nobody questioned it, a modern choice, people assumed, a progressive husband. Diane Farrow was 40 years old when my father died. They had been together for 19 years. They had two children, a boy named Tyler who was 17 and a girl named Amber who was 15. They had a house in Harwick that my father had helped purchase. His name was not on the deed. It was in Diane's name alone, which I later understood was a deliberate choice, not a romantic one. He had kept his financial exposure in Harwick contained. He paid for things in cash when he could. The paper trail between Dennis Calloway and Dennis Farrow was thin. 19 years. Tyler and Amber had grown up with a father who coached soccer and made pancakes on Sunday mornings. I don't know how to hold that. I have tried. I set it down. I pick it up again. I am still working on it. I want to tell you what our house felt like from the inside, during the years when I didn't know. The Mercer Street house was the kind of house that accumulates a life, not a showpiece, a lived-in place. The kind where the couch has a specific dent from a specific person sitting in a specific spot for years, where the kitchen table has a watermark from a mug that nobody bothered to use a coaster for, where the bookshelves are organized partly by subject and partly by the archaeology of when things were acquired. My mother ran that house the way she ran her nursing shifts, with a competence that looked effortless from the outside because she never made a production of the effort. The meals were good. The appointments were kept. The small things that make a house feel inhabited, fresh towels, working light bulbs, a yard that didn't shame you in front of the neighbors, were handled without announcement. My father contributed. I want to say that. He paid the mortgage, half from his salary. He did the outdoor maintenance. He was not a man who treated the house as my mother's job while he read the paper. He showed up for it. But the house was hers in the way that certain things belong to certain people regardless of what documents say. She had chosen the paint colors. She had decided which trees to plant and which to take down. She had interviewed the contractors and negotiated the estimates and stayed home from work the 3 days the roof was being replaced because she wanted to be there if something went wrong. The kitchen renovation took her 1 full summer and cost her the full range of emotions, and when it was done, it was perfect. Butcher block counters, subway tile backsplash, a farmhouse sink she had found on clearance at a salvage yard and refinished herself. My father said when he saw it finished, "Pat, this is the best room in the state of Ohio." He meant it. She knew he meant it. That was the thing about my father. His love, when he showed it, was real. I cannot call it performance because performance requires a distinction between the act and the feeling, and I don't think he was performing. I think he was genuinely two people, in a way that is both more understandable and more terrible than simple deception. My brother Marcus is different from me in how he has processed all of this. He is 20 years old now, and his response to learning about Harwick was to compress it into a single fact: Dad was a liar, and build a wall around that fact and not look at what's on the other side. I understand that. I don't do it that way. I look at both sides. It hurts more. I think it's more honest. The first fracture in the picture I had of my father appeared when I was 19. I had come home from college for spring break. My mother and I were in the kitchen. She was making soup. I was sitting at the island she'd refinished with the YouTube tutorial, and she said something that I filed away without understanding what I was filing. She said, "Your father has been different this past year. Quieter. I think something is worrying him." I asked if it was work. She said, "Maybe. Or maybe it's something else. I can't tell with him sometimes. After 25 years, I still can't always tell." It wasn't an alarm. It was a small cloud at the edge of the sky. I noted it and moved on. The second fracture was the following Christmas. My father was distracted in a way he'd never been before at holidays, present in body, absent in whatever the other thing is. He forgot to record the Christmas morning video he'd recorded every year since Marcus was born. My mother covered for it, said the camera battery had died. But later that night, I saw her watching him from the kitchen doorway while he sat in his chair with his book and didn't read a single page of it for 45 minutes. She was watching him the way you watch something you're trying to understand, carefully, quietly, without letting him see. I was home for Christmas. I went back to school in January. I didn't know what I had witnessed. I thought my father was tired or stressed or going through something ordinary that would pass. It was not ordinary, and she already knew that. I learned the truth in pieces, which is the worst way to learn something. Better the flood than the drip, because the drip leaves you standing in water up to your knees before you understand you're drowning. The first piece arrived in February of the year. I turned 22. I was living in Columbus by then, my first apartment after college, working at a landscape architecture firm as a junior associate. My mother called me on a Sunday evening. She had a voice I had not heard from her before, not upset, not frightened, but carefully neutral in the way that means someone is holding something very heavy and has decided to hold it standing up. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." She had found the previous week, while doing the quarterly review of their joint finances. She handled the household accounts, had for years, a pattern in my father's credit card statements that she could not explain. Regular charges at a gas station in Harwick. Regular charges at a grocery store in Harwick. A recurring charge at a pediatric dentist in Harwick 4 times a year for what had been, she calculated, at least 7 years. She had not confronted my father, not yet. She had done something else first. My mother is a nurse. She has spent 30 years working in an environment where you gather information before you act, where you do not move on a patient until you understand the full picture, where the most dangerous thing you can do is assume. She had applied that discipline to the worst thing she had ever had to investigate. Over the course of 8 days, while my father went to work and came home and ate dinner and watched television and went to bed, my mother had assembled a picture. She had hired a private investigator, a woman named Sandra Greer, who worked out of a one-person office downtown and who had, according to my mother's brief research, a specific reputation for discretion with exactly this kind of case. Sandra Greer had spent 4 days in Harwick. She had come back with photographs, an address, a name, and a fact that she delivered with professional gentleness: the children. My mother told me all of this on the phone, on a Sunday evening, in the voice she uses when she is determined not to fall apart. I sat on my apartment floor. I had slid off the couch at some point without noticing, and I held the phone and listened to my mother tell me that my father had a second family, that there was a woman named Diane, that there were 2 children, a boy and a girl, and the boy was 17 and the girl was 15, and they had been alive for my entire adolescence, and I had never known they existed. When she finished, I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "What are you going to do?" And she said, in a voice that was the steadiest thing I had ever heard, "I don't know yet, but I know the first thing." I asked what the first thing was. She said, "I'm going to talk to a lawyer before I talk to your father, because once I talk to him, things will start moving, and I want to know exactly where I'm standing before they do." My mother is the smartest person I know. She has always been the smartest person I know. In that moment, sitting on the floor of my Columbus apartment with my whole understanding of my family rearranging itself around me, that knowledge was the only solid thing I had. She had already called a lawyer. She was already standing on solid ground before she let the ground shake. I drove home the following weekend. Marcus was at school. My father was at a client dinner. I know now what I didn't know then, that the client dinner was in Harwick, that he was having the particular dinner that happened at the end of a week when his 2 lives had been running in parallel, and he had managed to keep them from touching. He came home at 11. I was in bed. I heard him come in, heard the particular sounds of a man who thinks the house is asleep: keys on the hook, shoes on the mat, the low murmur of the refrigerator being opened. I lay in the dark in my childhood bedroom and thought, "You don't know that we know. You think you are still the man we thought you were. You have 19 more years of that particular piece. He had less than 48 hours. I need to tell you about my mother's lawyer before I tell you about the conversation with my father, because the lawyer is why this story ends the way it ends. Her name was Catherine Voss. She had a practice downtown that specialized in family law and property, and she had been in practice for 28 years. And when my mother had called her the week after finding the credit card statements, Catherine had said, "Come in Thursday. Bring everything you have." My mother had brought everything she had. Catherine Voss had spent 2 hours with my mother, and had then explained something that my mother subsequently explained to me, and which I want to explain to you now, because it is the legal hinge on which this entire story turns. In the state where we lived, a married couple who jointly own a property hold it in what is called tenancy by the entirety. This means neither spouse can sell, transfer, or encumber the property without the consent of the other. It also means, critically, that if one spouse dies, the property passes automatically and entirely to the surviving spouse, outside of probate, regardless of what any will or separate document might say. Dennis Calloway's name was on the deed to the Mercer Street house, jointly with my mother. If my father died with his name still on that deed, the house passed entirely to my mother. Clean, automatic, no probate, no dispute, no opening for any other claim. If, however, my father and mother divorced, which would have been the obvious response to what my mother had discovered, the joint tenancy would be severed. The property would become subject to equitable distribution. And in the proceedings, any financial obligations my father had been carrying in Harwick could complicate the picture in ways that were difficult to predict. Divorce was not, Catherine told my mother, necessarily her strongest position. There was another option. My father could be asked, required, as part of any arrangement, to quitclaim his interest in the Mercer Street house to my mother alone. This would make my mother the sole owner of the property, removing it from any future estate proceedings, any future claims from any other party, and any legal territory that Diane Farrow or her lawyer might later attempt to occupy. The question was, would he do it? My mother's answer, which she gave Catherine Voss on a Thursday afternoon, was, "He will, if I ask him the right way." I want to tell you what that conversation looked like. It happened on a Saturday morning. Marcus was at a friend's house. I was there. My mother had asked me to be there, not in the room, but in the house. I think she wanted a witness in the building, or company for afterward, or both. I sat in the kitchen and listened to my parents have the conversation that ended my father's second life. My mother had laid it out on the dining room table before he came downstairs. The credit card statements, Sandra Greer's report, photographs of the Harwick house, a photograph of Tyler and Amber at what appeared to be a school event, their faces bright and ordinary. Completely unaware. My father came downstairs in his Saturday clothes and walked into the dining room and stopped. My mother was sitting at the table with her hands folded. She said, "Sit down, Dennis." I heard his chair. I did not hear him speak for a long time. What I heard, eventually, was a sound I had never heard from my father before. Not crying exactly, more like the sound of something structural giving way, a long exhale that had everything in it. My mother said, "I am not going to talk about how long this has been happening. We will talk about that later, or we won't. Right now, there is one thing I need you to do." She had the quitclaim deed ready. Catherine Voss had prepared it. She slid it across the table. She said, "You are going to sign this, today, in front of a notary, and then we are going to decide, together and separately, what comes next." She said, "The house is mine, Dennis. I built this house. I painted every room in it. I negotiated every contractor. I replaced the furnace when the warranty ran out because I understood the warranty better than you did. This house is mine, and I need your name off the deed before I can figure out what to do about everything else. If you love me, if any of what we have been to each other is real to you, you will sign this paper today." There was a very long silence. I heard my father say, "Patricia." My mother said, "Today, Dennis." He signed it. The notarized quitclaim deed, transferring full ownership of the Mercer Street property, to Patricia Ann Calloway was recorded at the county recorder's office the following Monday morning. My father's name came off the deed on a Monday in September. He died on a Thursday in February, 5 months later. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in December, moved fast the way that particular cancer moves, and he was gone before any of us had fully understood that he was going. My mother sat with him at the end. I want you to know that. She sat with him and she held his hand and she did not leave. Because she is that kind of person, and because whatever he was also the man she had loved for 28 years, and those things coexist in her the way they coexist in me, with difficulty and without resolution, permanently. He died at home, in the house on Mercer Street, in the bedroom where the curtains she had chosen, let in the morning, light in a way she had always loved. His name was not on the deed. It hadn't been for 5 months. Before I tell you about the knock on the door, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you love handle the worst thing that ever happened to them, and realize that their strength was the thing that protected you, even though you didn't know you needed protecting? Tell me in the comments. Drop your city and the time it is where you are. I read every single one, and I want to know who's listening. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button now and turn on the bell. This story is about to turn. Deanne Farrow had known about us for 4 months before my father died. I learned this later, much later in pieces, through the particular archaeology of aftermath. She had learned about us the same way my mother had learned about her, through a private investigator. Hers had been hired in October, 2 months after my mother confronted my father, during a period when my father, caught between 2 families who now both knew about each other, had become, by all accounts, a man barely holding his own weight. He had not told Diane about us voluntarily. She had found the other credit card, the one for Mercer Street, the mortgage payments, Marcus's school fees. She had hired someone to follow him on a Tuesday. The someone had followed him home. She had 19 years of a life she thought was real. She had 2 children who thought their father was their father in a simple, unambiguous way. She had a house in Harwick and a history and a name she had given him. I am not going to tell you that Diane Farrow was a villain. I am going to tell you what she did, and I am going to tell you that she did it from a place of genuine devastation, and I am also going to tell you that devastation does not protect you from the consequences of your actions. She hired a lawyer 3 days after my father's funeral. The lawyer's name was Robert Haig. He was, by reputation, a specialist in complex family law and estate disputes. He was the kind of lawyer you hire when you are prepared to fight. The theory of her case, as Robert Haig laid it out in the initial letter he sent to my mother via certified mail, 12 days after the funeral, was as follows. Dennis Calloway had lived as Dennis Farrow in Harwick for 19 years. He had held himself out as Diane's husband, not legally, as it turned out, since his legal marriage to my mother had never been dissolved, which meant the Harwick arrangement was common law at best and bigamous at worst, but functionally, financially, emotionally. He had contributed financially to Diane's household over those 19 years. He had represented himself, in multiple documented contexts, as having assets and property that would support Diane and the children in the event of his death. Robert Haig's letter argued that these representations constituted, under applicable law, a form of promissory estoppel, a legal doctrine that essentially says, if you make a promise and someone reasonably relies on that promise to their detriment, you can be held to it, or your estate can. The letter made a claim against the estate of Dennis Calloway. It listed, as an asset of that estate, the property at Mercer Street. My mother read the letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning. She read it once, then set it down, then picked it up and read it again. Then she called Catherine Voss. Catherine said, I've been expecting something like this. My mother said, what do I do? Catherine said, nothing yet, let them knock. They knocked 22 days after the funeral. I was there. I was staying at the Mercer Street house. I had taken leave from work. I wasn't ready to go back to Columbus, and my mother hadn't asked me to leave, and I hadn't asked whether I should. Marcus was there too, home from school, sleeping late the way 20-year-old men do when grief has made them heavy. I heard the knock from the kitchen. I heard my mother's footsteps from the bedroom. She had been awake. She was already dressed, which I noted without understanding until later. She went to the door. I came to the hallway. I saw the woman on the porch, well-dressed, carefully so. A man in a dark coat one step behind her. The particular posture of people who have prepared for a confrontation and are determined to be composed throughout it. I heard Deanne Farrow say her name. I heard her say my father had promised her half of everything. I heard my mother say, "I know who you are. Come in." I watched my mother step back from the door, invite this woman into her house. Her house. The house with the butcher block counters and the farmhouse sink and the tree house in the backyard. I watched her do it without hesitation. Because she knew. She had known for 5 months. She had known they were coming, and she had spent those 5 months making sure that when they arrived, she was already standing on ground they couldn't reach. They sat in the living room. My mother on one side, Diane Farrow on the other, Robert Haig in the armchair with his briefcase open across his knees. I sat on the stairs, not in the room but close enough to hear everything. My mother had not told me to leave. Diane Farrow, up close, was a woman who had been pretty in a particular way that grief and stress had not entirely erased. She had dark hair, careful makeup, the contained expression of someone who has cried until there is a temporary moratorium on crying, and she is in the moratorium now. She had a folder on her lap. Her hands were very still. She looked around the room, the living room my mother had furnished over 20 years, the bookshelves, the photographs on the mantel, the particular accumulated warmth of a house that had been a home, and her expression did something complicated for a moment. Then it settled back into contained. Robert Haig spoke first. He was professional, measured, and he laid out the case the way his letter had laid it out, in careful legal language that translated to. Dennis made promises to Diane. Dennis had assets. Those assets should have been Diane's to rely on, and the estate owes her and her children a portion of what Dennis represented he had. He named the Mercer Street property. My mother listened to all of it without interrupting. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she had the expression she gets when she is waiting for someone to finish so she can respond precisely. I know that expression. I have seen it in waiting rooms when doctors are being imprecise about things that matter. I have seen it at school board meetings and parent-teacher conferences. It is the expression of a woman who is going to say one thing and say it correctly. When Robert Haig finished, my mother said, "May I ask a question?" He said yes. She said, "What is the specific asset you're claiming against?" Haig said, "The property at this address. The marital home of Dennis Calloway, which represents his primary real property asset." My mother said, "Then I need to show you something." She stood up, went to the small writing desk in the corner of the room, the one she had found at an estate sale and refinished, and opened the top drawer. She came back with a document, a single page, attached to a county recorder's stamp. She placed it on the coffee table facing Robert Haig. It was the recorded quitclaim deed, executed in September, notarized, stamped and recorded by the county recorder's office, transferring full ownership of the Mercer Street property from Dennis and Patricia Calloway jointly to Patricia and Calloway solely. Robert Haig picked it up. He read it again. The room was very quiet. He said, "This was recorded in September." My mother said, "The 23rd, 5 months before Dennis died." Haig said, "He transferred his interest to you voluntarily." My mother said, "He did." Haig said, "Before his diagnosis." My mother said, 2 months before, the diagnosis was in December. Another silence, longer. Diane Farrow had been watching Robert Haig's face. She understood before he said anything that something had gone wrong. She said, quietly, "What does that mean?" Haig said, "It means the property is not part of Dennis's estate. It was transferred out of his name before his death. There is nothing here to claim against." Diane said, "But he told me." Haig said, "What he told you is not a deed, Diane. What he told you is not a legal instrument. If the property is not in the estate, we cannot make a claim against it regardless of what he represented. The room was very still. Diane Farrow looked at my mother. My mother looked back. I don't know what Diane Farrow was looking for in my mother's face. Maybe something she could work with: anger, or softness, or guilt, or the particular look of a person who has won something and knows it. What she found, I think, was none of those things. What she found was just my mother, a woman who had built a house and protected it, a woman who had known this day was coming and had made sure she was ready, a woman who was also, underneath all of it, a person who had loved the same man for 28 years and buried him 6 months ago and would carry that particular weight for the rest of her life, regardless of what he had done to deserve it. Robert Haig and Diane Farrow left the Mercer Street house an hour after they arrived. Not angry, exactly. Anger requires a target, and there was no clean target here. Haig had explained to Diane, in terms that were as gentle as they were unambiguous, that the case he had outlined depended on the house being part of Dennis's estate, and it was not. The promissory estoppel argument could potentially be made against the estate's other assets: my father's savings accounts, his retirement fund, his personal property, but those assets were modest compared to the house, and the legal cost of pursuing them might exceed their value. He would research further, he said. He would advise her. He did not sound optimistic. At the door, Diane Farrow paused. She turned back. She said, "Did you know, before he died, did you know about us?" My mother said, "I found out in February, a year ago." Diane said, "What did you do when you found out?" My mother said, "I called a lawyer." A pause. Diane said, "He told me about you near the end." He said. She stopped. She looked at the door frame, then back at my mother. "He said you were the one who built the life." He said that. My mother did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He was right." Diane left. My mother closed the door. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment, her back to me. Then she walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle, put it on the stove, and stood at the window looking at the backyard. I came and stood beside her. The tree house was still there, gray and a little overgrown, the rope ladder my father had hung when I was 9 still hanging from the platform. My mother looked at it. She said, "I want to take that down this spring." I said, "Okay." She said, "Not because of him, just because it's time." The kettle boiled. Over the following weeks, Robert Haig did what he said he would do. He researched the remaining estate assets and advised Diane on her options. Catherine Voss kept my mother informed at every step. The estate of Dennis Calloway, absent the Mercer Street property, consisted primarily of his retirement account, which named my mother as beneficiary, a designation he had never changed, possibly because changing it would have required acknowledging to someone official the existence of the Harwick life, and a savings account and his personal effects. The retirement account passed to my mother directly, outside of probate, by beneficiary designation. Another document with a name on it that didn't require a judge. Diane Farrow's attorney filed a claim against the estate for a share of the remaining assets, arguing the 19-year domestic partnership and my father's representations. Catherine Voss responded. There were letters and counter-letters, and the particular slow, bureaucratic movement of legal processes that grind forward whether you are watching them or not. It settled, eventually, not for what Diane had wanted. For a portion of the savings account, a figure that Catherine said was less than half of what Diane's initial claim had sought. It was not a victory for either of them. It was the kind of resolution that happens when two people have both been wronged by the same person, and there is not enough justice available to make either of them whole. My mother signed the settlement agreement at Catherine Voss's office on a Thursday morning. She came home and made lunch and called me in Columbus. She said, "It's done." I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I'm in my kitchen. I'm fine." I want to tell you about the part of this story that I find the hardest to hold. Tyler and Amber Farrow were 17 and 15 when their father died. They had not known about us until 4 months before he died, when Diane found out and the double life collapsed. By all accounts, and I have this in pieces, from things Marcus eventually learned, from things Diane's sister said at one point through an intermediary, from the particular way this kind of information travels in small communities. By all accounts, they had taken it the way that teenagers take the destruction of everything they thought was real. Badly, in the specific, acute way of people who are not yet old enough to have the tools for it. Tyler was 17. He had grown up with a father who coached soccer and made pancakes on Sunday mornings. The man who had done those things turned out to be a man who had been doing them 40 minutes away for another set of children at the same time, and the particular arithmetic of that, the halving of something you had believed was whole, is not something a 17-year-old has any framework for. I think about Tyler sometimes. I think about Amber. They did not choose any of this. They were children who were lied to in a way they had no way to detect or defend against, and the losses they carry are real losses regardless of the circumstances that surrounded them. I have not reached out to them. I don't know if I will. There is a version of this story where the two halves of my father's life might eventually face each other across a table and find something, not forgiveness. That's too large a word, maybe just acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that we were all lied to. That the grief is different for each of us, but the lying was the same. I hold that possibility. I don't know yet what to do with it. Marcus has no interest in it. He built his wall and he lives behind it. I respect that. People process what they can in the way they can, and Marcus was 20 years old when he found out his father had a secret family, and there is no correct response to that. My mother has the most grace about it, which should not surprise me but still does. She said once, several months after the settlement, "Those children lost their father the same way you did. The circumstances are different. The loss isn't." She said, "I'm not going to spend energy being angry at them. They didn't do anything." This is why she is the person I described at the beginning, the one who opened the door to the woman who had come to take her house and stepped back to let her in. Not from weakness, from certainty, from the particular calm of a person who knows exactly where she is standing. It is now 14 months since my father died. The Mercer Street house is still my mother's. It was always my mother's in every way that mattered, and now it is also legally, unambiguously, exclusively hers. No joint ownership, no estate complications, no claim from any direction that could reach it. Patricia Ann Calloway, sole owner in full. She repainted the living room last fall. A soft blue-gray that she had been thinking about for 2 years and hadn't done because my father preferred the warm white they had before. She did it on a Saturday with my help, the two of us in old clothes with rollers and music playing from her phone, the way we do things in that house. Practically, without ceremony, with a kind of pleasure in the doing of it. When we finished, she stood in the middle of the room and looked at the walls. She said, "I should have done this years ago." I said, "You had other things to do." She laughed, a real one, the kind that knows what it costs. The treehouse came down in April, as she had said it would. A Saturday morning, a rented lift, a neighbor who helped with the lumber. The maple tree looks different without it, more itself, I think, cleaner lines against the sky. The yard looks like it belongs fully to the present now, instead of holding a past it can't let go of. Marcus came home for the treehouse removal. He didn't say much. He stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets and watched it come down, and at one point he put his arm around my mother's shoulders, and they stood like that for a while without talking. My father was a man who built a tree house, and also built a lie large enough to contain a second family for 19 years. Both of those things are true. I am learning, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks, to let both be true without needing to resolve them into one. My mother, I think, has already done that work. She did it quietly, the same way she does most things that matter, without announcement, without asking for credit, in the specific hours of night when the house was asleep and she was sitting at the kitchen table she had chosen, under the light fixture she had picked out, in the house she had built. She is the person I want to be when I am her age. Not because she was untouched by what happened, because she was not undone by it. I want to leave you with something small. The week after Diane Farrow and her lawyer came and went, my mother and I were in the kitchen making dinner. She was at the stove. I was cutting vegetables at the butcher block counter she had installed herself, and she said something without looking up from what she was doing. She said, "The most important thing I ever learned about protecting yourself is that you have to do it before you need to. Not during, not after, before." She said, "Most people wait until the thing is happening. By then it's harder. By then someone else is already in motion and you're reacting instead of deciding." She turned the burner down. She said, "Catherine Voss asked me once why I was so calm when I came to her office that first time. After everything I just found out. She said most people come in shaking." I asked, "What did you tell her?" My mother said, "I told her I'd had 28 years to practice being the most prepared person in the room. I just hadn't known until then what I was preparing for." She served the soup. We ate at the kitchen table she had chosen, in the house that was hers, under the light she had picked out. Outside, the maple tree stood clean against the winter sky. If you are listening to this, and you are in the middle of something that feels like it is happening to you, I want you to hear my mother's voice. Before, not during, not after, before. Know where you stand. Find the person who can help you stand there correctly. Do the quiet work before the knock on the door. Because the knock will come, and when it does, the only question is whether you are ready. My mother was ready. That is the whole story. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe to Signed and Silent if you haven't. New story every week. I'll see you in the next one.